Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 266, let's go. This week we're sharing part 2 of a discussion with Sean Tolram. He's the head of mindfulness at HSBC. If you missed part 1 of our discussion with Sean in episode 265, I would say be mindful of the following. We met a young biotechnology student in Sean Tolram who decided he didn't like scientific research, but there was a bright spot. He discovered HTML and later became a web designer, did some interesting job rotations at IBM, and fostered an incredible environment of collaboration with his coworkers. And in that discussion with Sean, there are some great interview tips that we can use to create human connection in job interviews. This week in part 2, we'll get into the reasons Sean became a people manager and some of the gaps that he needed to fill once he took on that role. Then we pivot our discussion to all things mindfulness. We'll define it. What exactly is mindfulness? How did Sean get interested in it and start using it as a people manager? And what exactly is ahead of mindfulness? And how did he end up in that specific role? Sean will also share some practical tips on how we can use mindfulness to decrease stress. Let's jump into part 2 of our discussion with Sean Tolram.
It's one of those things where I wish I knew this stuff when I was younger. As I've become more experienced and I've seen the way the world works, that's where I've been able to figure these things out.
I feel like some of that understanding of needing to clarify and simplify your message comes with working with and for higher level leaders. So I think this is a perfect time to go into your transition into people management. You mentioned that you had gained this expertise, or at least enough exposure in different areas to be able to manage people from different teams. Was the decision point to becoming a people manager something you sought out? Something others encouraged you to do because they saw certain qualities? Or perhaps a mixture of both? I think there are a lot of listeners who are trying to decide, should I go into management? Should I not? Is that the only way for me to progress?
Yeah, and it's something that I didn't seek out. So I left IBM because I just wasn't enjoying my time there. And I went to a company called British Home Stores. You may not be familiar with them. They're a department store. A bit like, my US knowledge is not that great, Macy's or Sears. They're like big department stores, right? Mm-hmm. So it was one of those. And I went there as a developer to build an e-commerce site for them. I wasn't looking to be a manager or to manage a team. I was just looking to do my job. But then as the time went on, I found that I was really enjoying helping other people. So there were a few younger people in the team, less experienced. They were struggling with certain things. So I spent time with them, helping them to overcome their challenges. They were then able to perform better and their careers started moving in the right direction. Their managers noticed, and because they appreciated it, they told their managers, look, I spent time with Sean. He helped me to overcome this thing. I taught one of the members of my team HTML. So after work, we were having a 20-minute HTML session on most days. She was then able to build web pages for the company. And it was from doing that that I then became known as somebody who's able to make other people better. So when you put Sean into a team, the people around him are likely to become better at certain things. When I think back now, I realized that that was the point where I stopped chasing the money and chasing the promotions. And I just stopped thinking about it. Prior to that, when I was at IBM, it was all about how do I get rich? I want to be rich. I want to retire by the time I'm 50. It's the money. It's the pay rises. It's the bonuses. This is what I want. But at that point, when I stopped thinking about that and I just started enjoying my work and enjoying the people that I was with, I realized that I enjoyed helping other people. That then led me into management roles because as the teams restructured and the organization changed direction, they needed people to manage certain teams. And they said, oh, we know Sean has shown that he's able to do this. Let's put him in that role. And that's kind of how it happened. So no, I didn't really go after it, but it was through the behaviors that I was showing that I put myself in that position.
And do you think it's fair to say that if we're helping to make people better, either by building their technical skills or perhaps their non-technical soft skills, that both of those are looked upon equally as relatable experience to become a people leader?
I think so. What I was not good at in my earlier career was managing upwards. So I was very good at working with my own team. Managing upwards, for me, it's still a skill that I find very difficult, and I admire people who are able to do that well. When I started to put a bit more focus on that and doing things that I was less comfortable with, that's when I started to notice that difference. So I became sort of a bridge between my team and senior management. And as we progressed, senior management, if they had something that they wanted to say to the team or do, they would come to me, and then I would communicate it to the team. So it's all those little things that added up where it was kind of management type behaviors, even though I wasn't called a manager, that then led to me being given that role.
How is the way you manage up different when you are a frontline people manager who has to manage up to probably a director, a manager of managers, to the way that we as individual contributors like myself would manage up to our manager? Because there's some level of managing up to your boss and communicating with your direct boss. I'm just curious, in your mind, what were the differences in the way you had to go about it?
It was learning what senior management care about and what they don't care about. So one of the mistakes that I was making was I was giving them too much information. And that's what I was used to earlier in my career. So my direct line manager wanted to know everything that I was doing, probably a bit of micromanagement going on there. But I was having to provide lots of information. So rather than saying, we did this, this was the impact, it was okay, we did this, this is how we did it, we then did this, and then we had this problem, but then we overcame the problem. And it was a lot of information. But managing upwards to senior management, it's all about cutting out the fluff and getting straight to the point, because that's all they want, and working out what those big, impactful statements that they want to know about. Because if you give them a deck full of information, they're unlikely to read it. And even if they do, they're unlikely to remember a lot of it. But it's those big, powerful statements, those headlines that they will then take away. So it was changing the way that I communicate. Where previously I was communicating in exactly the same way to everybody I was working with. It was now thinking, okay, depending on the person I'm speaking to, I'm going to communicate in a slightly different way to achieve the outcomes that I want to.
And did you seek out any guidance from peers on how to do this better? Is this where mindfulness comes into the story? I'm really curious on that.
I wish I had sought feedback from peers. Yeah, it wasn't something that I was doing at the time. Feedback is always one of those words, isn't it? Where it's often seen as a bad thing. So it was learning on the job. It was testing and learning, but in terms of relationships and conversations. So similar to back in my science days, similar to back when I was writing code, testing and learning the social aspects of the working environment. Now, because I did it that way, it took a lot longer than it probably should have. So, I only really became comfortable with it in my 40s. But yeah, that was the way that I did it.
Well, we have to learn by banging our head against the wall a little bit, right?
Yeah, exactly. You've got to work for it sometimes. It took a while, but I got there. And then as I started progressing as a manager, the teams that I was managing were becoming bigger, and it became less about me. So it became less about the work that I could deliver and more about the people, because it was the performance of those people that was reflecting on me. So if the team weren't performing well, even if I was, it doesn't matter. It's my team. If the team make a mistake, if there's an error that goes live on the website, it's not the fault of the person who made the error. It's my responsibility because I'm heading up the team. And that was quite a change of mindset for me. Just realizing that. I then started to think, okay, well, how do I support people in performing to the best of their ability? Because I was realizing that I had talented, intelligent people and they weren't performing as well as I thought they could. There was lots of errors going live. So this is at HSBC now. Errors going live on the live websites that were being accessed by customers. And I started looking at management techniques. I bought lots of books about people management. I was doing lots of reading, trying different things. Nothing was working. And then I started implementing principles of mindfulness. So helping people to understand the impact of stress and how to deal with it. And through this learning, I realized that actually the team were working in a state of constant stress. And most teams that I was looking at were in a similar situation, because at the time we were being judged by the amount of updates we could make per day. So yeah, the number of updates were being counted. And if people weren't making enough, then a conversation would be had. This had people in a state of stress, and it meant that people were publishing content live when perhaps they shouldn't.
Oh man, that's an interesting metric. Just so many, so many red flags.
Yeah, yes, yeah, exactly. Fortunately, I was in a position where I could change that. So by slowing things down and giving people time to think about their mental state, whether they should be hitting that button to send content live, giving them the freedom to take breaks, to just take a breather if they need to, we were able to reduce the error rate. So the error rate actually reduced by about 50%. It was a significant change. And all we had done was introduced some principles of mindfulness. So it wasn't that we were all going off and meditating for hours. It was more around understanding how our brains worked and creating an environment where our brains could be at their best.
So I take a lot of that to mean that you really enjoyed the people management aspect, perhaps more than you thought?
Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise. I ended up just leaving my technical skills behind. I never really felt like I wanted to go back to being a developer or a designer. I had that knowledge, and I didn't want to go back to being a specialist. I was enjoying helping other people to specialize in certain areas. I was enjoying bringing teams together and figuring out how to get them to move together towards a goal or an objective. And I was enjoying just seeing people grow and improve and achieve the careers that they wanted to. And it's one of those things, like with the first time when I did HTML and it felt very easy and natural, I had that feeling again. All felt very natural, like this is what I was supposed to be doing the whole time.
I feel like one has to become a little less technical if you're going to go into people management, no matter what. You could still be technical, but you need to be more focused on the people because that's the job. Did you ever have any kind of, if I go in this direction, I won't be technical anymore? Sometimes that's part of our identities as technical people or technologists, and it might be difficult to get past that.
Yeah, I was worried at one point because your skills become out of date quite quickly, more so now than ever. So, 1 or 2 years out as a manager and you come back, you can't perform at the top level. You've got some learning to do. You've got to catch up. And I was a bit concerned about that. And it took a bit of thought. And I just had to sit down and think, right, Sean, what do you enjoy? What is it that you would like to do for the rest of your career? And for me, it was an easy decision. For some people, it won't be. It will be quite a dilemma, I can imagine. But fortunately for me, it was clear that was what I enjoyed. Actually, when I think about it, because there were aspects of the technical side that I did enjoy, I've kept up with that because I was doing freelance work on the side. So I was building websites for people on WordPress, just in my spare time, sometimes for free, sometimes for a few pounds. that then became more kind of a hobby than the actual full-time job that I was doing. But yeah, I guess now you mention it, I did kind of try and hold on to that a little bit.
I like the side hustle to keep yourself sharp.
Yeah.
But it does become fun. I mean, for me, the podcast is just something I do for fun on the side. I really enjoy talking to interesting people like yourself and learning from them. And I really like what you said earlier about giving your team permission to take a break or care for themselves. I was having a conversation with someone the other day and they were sick. And I said, then you should take some time to recover. And the person said, well, that would be better than a full day of meetings. I was like, yeah. And I told that person, it's even more important that you do it because you have a team of people that you manage. And you need to model that behavior for them and then tell them it's okay to do the same. Because maybe I have a bias here, but until I had a manager that did both of those things, I felt a lot more pressure to work even though I was sick, for example.
Yeah, I've seen so many times the attitude and the personality of the line manager, it filters down across the team. So if the line manager is panicking and becoming anxious about certain things, then the team become anxious. But if something goes wrong and the line manager is very calm and they're able to deal with it in a clear, logical way, then the team will follow suit. So yeah, that's another really great skill that doesn't often come naturally. And I do see people management as a skill, like learning a language or learning a musical instrument. There's all these elements that have to be learned. But for many of us, me included, we end up in a someone puts us into that position because of something else, because of some other reason. And it's not always because we're good at managing people. So I think it's really important to treat it as a skill, read the books, do as much as you can to become an amazing people manager, because at the end of the day, you're there to serve your people in the best possible way. And you need to continue developing that ability so that you can continue to do the best for them.
100%. And I'm sure that studying the mindfulness aspect and then educating your team on it was even more helpful. But I think maybe we should just very briefly define what we mean when we say mindfulness. I have a feeling people may not always understand what that's meaning based on the context.
Yeah, so for me, I would say that mindfulness is about having awareness of what's going on so that you can make decisions about how you live your life. So it's that awareness. And the reason that's important is because most of the time we're walking around in a state of autopilot. We're kind of letting things happen to us. If you imagine a typical day at work, you've got a task you're working on, you've got an email inbox that's constantly filling up, you're jumping over there answering the emails, then a Teams, a Slack message or something, instant messaging pops up, you jump over to do that, you get a phone call, and then you try and get back to this thing that you were working on. You're being pulled around, you're not in control of where your attention is going. And that is becoming more common now as technology is advancing. There's more and more ways for people to contact us. And there was a study that showed that workers like us in the 1970s were receiving about 3 inputs per day, like a phone call or an internal mail, whereas now for us, it's more like 300 per day. But the human brain hasn't evolved much since the 1970s. And that's where you start to get that information overload, where we actually can't get around to everything. So with mindfulness, it helps you to notice when you're being distracted and then bring your focus back to where you want it to be. That's one area that it can help with. I've used mindfulness practically in the working environment to help with my public speaking. So to help me recognize the symptoms of stress, noticing that my heart's beating a little bit faster than normal, my body temperature is going up, and practicing so that you can notice those things a little bit earlier before you get on the stage maybe, and then practicing tools that you can use to help calm yourself down and move you into the right state to deliver that presentation or have that conversation. It can also help let's say you're in a meeting and someone says something that triggers you. Someone maybe takes credit for your work or subtly criticizes something that you've done. Straight away, your primitive brain kicks into action. It senses danger, and you go into fight or flight, where you're being primed to either kill or run away, because that's kind of the primitive stress response, as if you're being faced with a wild animal. Now, in our world, the outcome of that is perhaps we would snap back and say something we regret. Later on, we might think back and say, I really let myself down there. With mindfulness, and it's not easy, it doesn't always work, but you can develop the ability to create that gap. So noticing when you've been triggered and being able to take a breath and think, okay, no, I'm not going to go down that route. I'm going to respond in a more thought through, logical way. Even with emails, sometimes someone will send an email sort of criticizing you, copying lots of people in to make them aware. Straight away, you'll want to be back on the email, replying, defending your territory. That's what your brain's telling you to do. Again, by creating that gap, it allows you to respond rather than react. So lots of applications in the working environment. Mindfulness is thousands of years old. It has origins in the Buddhist religion. But in the late 1970s, it was brought into the Western world and tailored so that it would be more accessible for people in the West. It's now filtered down to organizations. Navy SEALs are using mindfulness. Elite athletes are using mindfulness. My kids in school are doing mindfulness. It's now becoming more mainstream as people start to see the benefits. But you've got to be careful because I find it beneficial. I've got to be careful about overselling it, because it's not going to make all your problems go away. It gives you the awareness. So it may make you aware. It may make you more aware of your problems and how they're affecting you. But what I always say is that then gives you information that you can use to make decisions about what you do next. That was a really long explanation. You can see I'm very interested in this subject.
I really enjoyed that explanation. I hadn't realized the historical context there. What do we mean, Sean, when we say someone has a mindfulness practice? And is mindfulness the same thing as meditation, or are they different?
So they're kind of related, but for me, mindfulness is something that you can do in the moment when you need it. So if you're stuck in traffic and you feel yourself starting to get irritated, or when someone jumps in front of you in the coffee queue and your primitive brain is telling you, kill, 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 you can do a quick breathing practice. You can do a body scan to notice, your muscles tightening up and those sorts of things. So mindfulness is very much something you can do in the moment. You can do it while washing the dishes. Now, with mindfulness, as you progress, meditation is a part of it. So that's part of the practice. So having that time, maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes, when, as an example, you might be doing a breathing practice. So you'd sit and you'd focus on the breath. You'd then obviously become distracted. There'll be so many things going on in your mind all the time. And what you're practicing is the ability to notice when the distraction has appeared and go, that was a distraction. I've noticed it. I'm now going to make a decision to return my focus to the breath. So that's a mindfulness practice. We say mindfulness is a gym for the brain, and that's like doing reps in the gym for the brain. So noticing when you're distracted and then bringing your attention back. And then the more you practice that, the easier and more automatic it becomes. So you can then apply it in those tough situations when you need it the most. So that's an example of a practice. Meditation is where you would take time out. You would do a meditation separately, whereas mindfulness is something that you can do in the moment when you need it. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And it definitely tracks with some books I've read in that area. Like Mark Devine wrote Way of the Seal, and he talks about having a mind gym that you go to and practice, just as you said. And I think it's Amishi Raj wrote a book called Peak Mind, and they did studies of people in the military and all kinds of folks, and how the sweet spot was 12 minutes of meditation per day can improve your decision making and lower stress levels, as you said. And meditation is not this, either that or the modified version of it that you get within the Calm app, let's just say. It's not this weird ancient must light a bunch of candles and say something weird over and over. I think there's a conception out there that if I'm meditating, though, that's just weird. It's just odd. I'm doing something seems like I'm a member of a cult,
Yeah, and that is a really great point. I'll sort of respond to that by saying to you that I've been doing mindfulness throughout this conversation since we started. I'm guessing you won't have realized that I'm doing it.
Never did. No.
In the moments when you're talking, I'm noticing signs of stress in myself because this is an unusual situation for me. I don't often get to talk about myself this much, which is kind of nice. But being on a podcast, unusual situation, my brain is saying potential danger here. So I'm noticing my shoulders are raised slightly. I can kind of feel like every now and again I'm starting to talk a little bit faster than I normally would do and feeling a little bit warm. So when you're speaking, I'm doing a very kind of discrete mindfulness exercise just to kind of bring myself back down and maintain a certain level so that I can speak to you in a clear and coherent way.
And you probably have better posture than me as a result. I need to work on that.
It's funny, isn't it? As soon as you say the word posture, everyone starts like adjusting themselves. But yeah, that's an example of how with mindfulness, you're able to do that. And it's not easy. It's not, you can't just suddenly start doing that. I'm able to switch it on and off because I also practice. I do those 10, 20, 30-minute practices in order to hardwire that way of thinking in my brain. So then I can just do it when I need it.
As in all things, you have to practice to get better and better at it. Here's what I want to know, Sean. We practice this as an individual. You were very passionate about it in your conversation. We can tell that. You shared it with your team after becoming a leader. So at some point, you shifted your focus in your job to be more around mindfulness than perhaps about the technology. Can you talk to us a little bit about why you made that shift? Because I have seen people, or we've talked to people who have had something they were very passionate about, and they were able to then make it a job. And so I'm always curious, what's that like? And was it still exciting and still a passion once it became part of your job? I mean, spoiler, it definitely is for you.
In my previous role at HSBC, I was managing the teams that put out content across the HSBC websites. So very busy, high pressure role. I was seeing lots of people burn out, become sick through work. A lot of those people would take time off, receive treatment, come back and do the same thing again, go through exactly the same cycle. I was also seeing that even though I was giving my team the opportunities to look after themselves, they were choosing not to. So if I was noticing that people weren't taking lunch breaks, I'd mention it to them and I tried to make them comfortable with taking lunch breaks. But some people were not comfortable with taking lunch breaks because of the teams they'd worked with in the past and the cultures that they'd experienced. So I was noticing this. I then started to realize that we go through the entire education system without learning much about our brains, unless we're studying neuroscience. We then enter the world of work, which is often set up in a way that our brains don't like and put our brains into a state of threat. But we don't have the skills and the tools to do something about it because we know nothing about our brains, which is amazing when you think what the brain actually does for us. And I started to realize, okay, so throughout my career, I've progressed to being a manager because I really enjoyed helping people. I like to see them progress. But I'm now seeing that when I teach them about how their brain works and help them to create a brain-friendly environment, that's helping them more than anything else. So I then started going further and further into mindfulness because that was helping me to help other people, which was what I was enjoying. So that was the link there. And then in terms of becoming the head of mindfulness, that was more luck than anything clever that I did. I was kind of known as the mindfulness guy because I was doing these things in my team. I was known sometimes in a good way, sometimes not a good way. People were thinking it was a bit strange, but they knew I was doing mindfulness. And then COVID-19 arrived. We were hit with a pandemic, and suddenly lots of organizations were looking at how to support the well-being of their staff. Some of it was genuine, some of it was to tick a box. We have to be honest about that. And HSBC at the time decided to create a permanent mindfulness team because they'd seen the positive results that were happening. And because I had already been doing mindfulness, I was doing bits and pieces, and I'd been sending that up to senior management to let them know, when that opportunity came up, they came to me and asked if I would come in and head up the team. So it was sort of because I was putting myself out there. It's because of what I was putting out there. But then also it was a bit of luck where I was in the right place at the right time. And yeah, fortunately, I was able to move into the mindfulness team, which allows me to continue helping people with their careers, but just in a slightly different way, which I think is more beneficial than what I was doing in the past.
Would you see that type of role in the average organization reporting up through human resources, or sort of a different organizational structure within the company?
We're separate to HR only because because of where we receive our funding from. If we were starting again from scratch, perhaps we would be going in through HR. But what I like about being separate is that we're able to operate across all areas of HSBC. So there's no kind of restrictions, nothing that's stopping us. So if we decide we want to go to this area, we can. I used to say if we were starting again, we'd be part of HR. But actually now I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure because the way we are at the moment, it gives us that flexibility and it gives us that coverage. And there's not as many limitations on what we can and can't do.
It's interesting because it allows you to break out of the siloed environment, or at least operate above, around, inside all the silos, just like you did back in that job where you decided to talk to people who were in development and talk to people who were in testing and quality control to get a feel for what they did. Yeah, I like that. The external organization, or at least somewhat external to other groups, allows you to look at both the benefits of mindfulness to people across the company in different roles, but also take stock of the different challenges they're facing, which maybe is in some way specific to their role or their location or job function.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of focus on well-being in the corporate world at the moment, and often well-being is within HR. But I'm hearing a lot more people talk now about how perhaps well-being shouldn't sit in HR. Well-being should be placed across the organization so that it can have a bigger impact. And those are the conversations that are now starting to happen.
And if my company maybe doesn't have a well-being program or doesn't seem to care that much about it, think they should do it, what advice would you have for me?
With mindfulness, we just started doing it. So we didn't ask for permission. We didn't wait for budget or anything like that. We were just doing it and then reporting back on the results. So if you have that freedom and flexibility, then that's always a good way to do it. Prove yourself and then show them why they can't live without you. There's now more and more studies that are showing that link between health and well-being and performance at work and organizational results. Getting on Google and putting up some of the latest studies, it can create a really compelling story about the benefit of well-being in an organization. If you just look at the stats for stress is one of the biggest causes of long-term absence from work. When you're stressed, lots of things happen. I won't go into it now because there's a lot, but it has an impact on your health and you can become ill. When you become ill, you need to take time off work. That then leads to absenteeism, also leads to staff turnover. Also presenteeism, where people are still working, but they're not able to perform to the best of their ability because they're not in a fit state to be doing it. So when you plug some numbers in, you can see the cost of stress to an organization on average. And the numbers are massive. So now with the data that we've got, it's not difficult to create a really strong business case in terms of the bottom line numbers to show people that this is why we should have a well-being team.
And creating the business case is just the next iteration for you of managing up.
Exactly. And it can be a scary thing to think, right, I'm going I'm proposing something new that we don't do at the moment. I've now got to go to these senior people and give them my idea. Well, who am I to go and give them an idea? They won't have time of day for me. So overcoming that barrier is a key step, because a lot of the time, people in that position, they want someone to come to them with a proposal, someone who's passionate about something and say, look, this is what I want to do, because it makes their lives easier, because they can't think of everything and they can't get around to everything. So having those people who can just give them something and say, look, I've really thought this through. This is why we should do it. More often than not, they're happy that you've done that, because it's something that they haven't had to get stuck into.
So it sounds like you're saying that we shouldn't be afraid to talk to people 1, 2, 3 levels above our level at an organization if we have an idea we think would benefit them.
Exactly. And it's easy to say, but I find it very difficult. Even with my direct line manager, I don't know if anyone else has this, but you get an instant message saying, can we have a 5-minute chat?
Oh, yeah.
Straight away, straight response.
Oh, yeah.
Right? There's evolutionary reasons for this, because it's all about kind of our place in the troop and the social hierarchy and the fear of being kicked out of the troop and then not being able to survive. So there's primitive reasons for all this. So it's not an easy thing to overcome. So if you're someone who is having difficulty with this, don't feel bad. Don't think that you're doing anything wrong. What you're doing is normal as a human being. What we're talking about here is going against your natural human instincts, which is very difficult. And the way to do that is going to be different for every person, because everyone has a different brain that works differently. But recognizing it is the first step, and realizing and making that decision that you want to do something and figuring out what's the method for me doing that. It's fraught with danger, as well as just being worried about the response you get. What if you go 2, 3 levels above? Is that going to offend your direct line manager because you've gone above them? There's all these sorts of things to think about. How do you navigate that? Do you have to go to your line manager first? Well, what if your line manager is somebody who just isn't interested in this thing, but the person above them, you think they would be interested? How do you do that? It's a really difficult situation.
It's hard, for sure. More stress, just like you said. I know we don't want to get too deep into stress, but since we talked about mindfulness and the ability to decrease your stress there, are there any things in addition to that practice that you do to decrease stress that might help our listening audience?
It's useful to have an understanding at a biological level of what happens when you're stressed. So when you are stressed, your brain has sensed danger, and it's reacted in the same way that it did for our ancient ancestors. It's reacting as if you're faced with a wild animal, except the world around us has changed, and it might not be a wild animal. It might be a line manager, or it might be a colleague. Recognizing that when you're in that state of stress, certain things will happen to you. Now, the stress response is an ingenious part of our evolution. We shouldn't think of it as a bad thing, because if you think about it, when we become stressed, the blood rushes to the muscles in our arms and legs. Our bodies are flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. Our pupils dilate. Our hair stands on end. We start breathing faster. We start pumping more blood around the body. It's almost like a superpower where you're being primed to fight or run away. That's why, you hear these stories about the mother who was able to pick up a car and save her child, because our bodies are capable of more than we realize, but there's certain restrictions. But when you go into that stress response, things change slightly. So with that awareness, you can start to recognize those symptoms of stress as they appear. Before I dialed in for this podcast, I did this. I recognized that my heart rate, my breathing, it was starting to go in that direction. So I did a 2-minute mindfulness practice before I dialed in. And just the act of breathing is a really simple way to reduce the levels of stress. And I know everyone always says, take a breath, just take a breath. But there's science behind it. Because if you think about it, when you're stressed, right, your breathing speeds up because you're trying to get more oxygen into the body. So by consciously slowing down the breath, you're signaling to your brain, I'm okay. I'm not in danger. I'm not going to die right now. That then creates a cascade that can calm down your nervous system and move you into a more relaxed state. If we're looking for just one really quick, simple thing that we can do to reduce stress, it would be to focus on your breathing and just to notice what's happening with your breath.
And I've heard people say, and maybe you can validate whether this is accurate, that if you're going to breathe like that, you can make your exhale longer than the inhale to help your body relax more. Is that accurate? Is that something you found to be true?
Yeah, you've done your research. Yeah, and it's a way to slow down the breathing. It gives us a way to do it. Some people like to count to 3 on the in-breath, count to 4 on the out-breath, as you're saying. It just allows you to take control of the breathing process rather than it running away with you, creating that cascade. So yeah, that is certainly one way to do it. Another really quick technique is a body scan, which can be very useful. You can do it in a few seconds. So for example, right now, I can just place my attention on my shoulders and just notice what's going on there. They're actually a little bit tight. So if you look at my shoulders now, they're a little bit tight because I'm in an unfamiliar situation. Even though I'm enjoying it very much, it's an unfamiliar situation. And see how far they go down. That's the difference that the stress in this situation is causing. So by doing a quick body scan, you can scan through your whole body and notice what's going on and start to become familiar with how you react in stressful situations. And then if you want to, you can relax it. But it's that awareness that's key, because often we don't even think about these things. The reason that our muscles tighten like this is because, again, we're getting primed to spring into action, to do battle, but we don't need to do battle. And by noticing it, we can just take a breath and just calm it down.
Are there any, as we get closer to wrapping this up, Sean, are there any books or podcasts that you would recommend that have helped you with mindfulness and stress reduction?
I would say Your Brain at Work by David Rock. Really good, really practical, and it shows how mindfulness can be applied in the working environment. And that's kind of my take on mindfulness. That's the area that I like. And also, there's one called How to Be a Productivity Ninja. Now, this isn't a mindfulness book, but it talks about how to value your time, how to create conditions where you can be at your best, how to manage your inbox, how to manage your calendar. And for me, the author probably didn't mean it, but for me, it's a book about mindful working. So managing your inbox mindfully, managing your calendar mindfully. So How to Be a Productivity Ninja. I'd say that's a really good book as well.
We'll definitely put those in the show notes. Really appreciate it. If anybody wants to follow up with you after this conversation, Sean, and maybe ask some more questions about anything we've discussed, where can they find you?
Oh, well, I'm on LinkedIn, so they can find me on there. And I talk to a lot of people about this. I have companies contact me because they want to create a mindfulness program and they're not sure how to get started. I have individuals come to me because they want to do something personal, that they want, some personal coaching or mentoring or whatever it is. So yeah, find me on LinkedIn, and I'm really happy to have a chat.
Well, thank you so much, Sean, for taking the time to share your expertise with our listeners. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Nick. It was really nice to speak to you today. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. I want to take a second to say a special thank you to Leanne Elliott for introducing me to Sean Tolram and suggesting he be a guest on the show. Leanne and her husband Al Elliott run a wonderful podcast called the Truth Lies in Workplace Culture podcast. Definitely check it out, because I think it could be valuable to all of our listeners. We heard that Sean became a people manager because he enjoyed helping others. He didn't do it for the glory. He spotted a need and felt like he could serve that specific need. And he was helping people in his spare time. He gives the example of helping someone with HTML. That improved their performance, and that person and other individuals went and told their manager that Sean had helped make them better. This indirect communication of his impact was how he developed a reputation for helping others. And that is part of the reason he became a people manager. If he hadn't developed that reputation, maybe people would not have considered him for that manager role. I actually think that this helping others is not that different from when he was a web designer trying to learn about other people's roles, whether it be developers or testers. By taking the time to learn about those other people and what they did, it made the overall team better. And the story is very similar when he got into mindfulness. The mindfulness techniques and Sean learning about and using them with his team is really what made the biggest impact as a manager. That's kind of what broke him loose in terms of effectiveness. So he was using the techniques not only for himself, but for his team. He was sharing what he learned, but then he took it a step further. In this case, Sean shared the results of that work up the chain. He shared it with his manager, creating some of those impact statements. And that was part of the reason he developed a reputation as the mindfulness guy. People knew he used it. People knew he was excited about using it. And they understood that it was having a real impact on the company and the people working at that company. If you're looking to hear more about mindfulness, I would highly encourage checking out episode 192 with Brett Hill. There are some great discussions of using mindfulness in interviews and what a mindfulness practice is in that episode. We talked a lot about stress. If you want to hear more about stress specifically, check out episode 90. That's our book review of The Inner Game of Stress. And then I would also highly recommend checking out episode 214, which covers the connection between stress and burnout. We had burnout expert and coach Kate Donovan on the show, and she says that burnout prevention tools are stress management tools, and there is no difference. That's definitely well worth the listen. Kate has a great podcast called Fried, and the goal of that is to end burnout culture. When Sean was recounting telling people on his team it was okay to take lunch breaks, they were still hesitant to do it because of being in a different culture where that really wasn't a thing. That wasn't allowed. People felt like they had to work through lunch. It's amazing the impact that being in a toxic culture, or maybe a slightly more unhealthy culture than we're in now, even once we're out of that culture and into a better one. So I hope for all the managers listening that you'll realize it's up to you to foster the team culture, because as we talked about in episode 238, managers are culture keepers. That's a great discussion with guest Leanne Elliott if you haven't heard it. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Sean. We'll see you next time.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.